Hello, everyone, and welcome to our FanDuel defense breakdown. We call it the Blitz. Jason wrote this article. Pretty excited about it. I am Russell Clay. You can find me on Twitter at Russell J. Clay. You can find Jason Gilbo at whatever his last name is, which is really weird, and I have no ambition to learn how to ever spell, honestly.
Yeah, well, it's Jay Gilbo,
Yeah,
pretty
well.
simple. There's a couple extra vowels and T's in there that you don't need, but
Right. Well, once you get into like three or four vowels in a name, it starts to get like, am
why does
I?
it
I'm
why
gonna
does
have
it
to
feel
sit
like
down.
we're meeting each other for the very first time here? We've done
Yeah.
pods throughout the year here,
Oh. Oh yeah. But I mean, if you're just tuning in for the first time, it sort of seems like we haven't, which is the type of, that's the vibe I like to give off. Uncomfortable and skittish.
You do that well.
Okay. Anyway, we're supposed to be looking at some FanDuel defenses here. Let's take a look at some cash games first. So you have the Seahawks listed here. What about the Seahawks interests you?
Well, you look at Miami, there's a lot of question marks, and it starts really with the running game. That obviously you got an Arian Foster who's 30 years old, hasn't played a full season in quite some time. You got a backup there in Jay Ajayi, who, really guy who was pretty much unknown. And then you look at that offense, and as far as the passing game goes, you expect them to be playing from behind most of this game, especially on the road here and with that Russell Wilson offense. I just feel like this is just a perfect opportunity for Seattle to really dominate and even come away with some turnovers and some possible upside, because obviously you look at last year, Seattle wasn't the most, high ceiling defense there was, but they were just kind of clutch. They'd still sit around 10 points, which is, obviously you're just looking to kind of stay afloat, and you're paying for that here.
Right now, in terms of PPR value, you kind of look at Jarvis Landry and say, okay, well, he could get his 10 catches for 60 yards, but you know what? That still means like that's still fine for the Seahawks. And I agree. And you look at Devontae Parker, looks like he's going to be out. So that's really their big play threat there. Other than Kenny Stills, I'm buying Seahawks as well. I like that call.
Yeah, definitely. As you mentioned, Landry, it's like he could go 8 catches for 90 yards. But
Yeah.
He didn't score a ton of touchdowns last year. I don't expect him to this game.
No, and them even getting to the red zone very often. And like you mentioned last time, Arian Foster was out and about, averaging under 3 yards per carry. So, yeah. Anyway, Vikings versus Titans. What'd you see there?
One, if you want to drop down in price, you got a couple $100 difference. Obviously, Minnesota's on the road. You usually like to play defenses at home. But you look at Tennessee. They turned over the ball quite a bit last year, tied for first in that ranking. Still a team total below 20, which you like. And you feel like Minnesota, their defense is obviously going to turn up the pressure, given the fact that the offense is a lot of question marks there with now Sam Bradford, Sean Hill, whoever's going to lead the way. But Minnesota, very underrated in my opinion. Top 10 secondary, top 10 front seven. You still look at Mariota. I think if he had a couple more playmakers around him in terms of consistency, and maybe we've seen this offense be kind of stay in one shell for the last few seasons, and they're building, I'd probably be off of the Vikings there. But because there's still a lot of question marks, and because that wide receiver core really isn't that great, I just like the Vikings to come through. And obviously, one team I did leave off is the Chiefs. I think they were kind of another obvious play at home against the Chargers, up in that tier with Seattle. But I like the Vikings. I think they're kind of overlooked.
Vikings are very interesting. And as you mentioned, I think the Chiefs are going to get the ownership because it seems like, I don't know if you've been playing DFS for the last 3 years, it seems like the Chiefs always get the ownership. Vikings interesting in terms of cash. I think it's a great matchup. You kind of look at, Sharp and DGB and all that stuff that happened, in preseason. He's not even there anymore. So Kendall Wright's banged up. It's just going to be tough beyond Delaney Walker to really trust anyone early in the season. I think Vikings have a great shot at shutting them down.
Yeah, definitely. And you look, last year they ranked fifth in points allowed. They were very solid, and they don't get let a lot of teams go into the red zone, which is nice. So I just can't see. I like Mariota here. I think he's going to have a good season, but I can't see him kind of breaking things through against this Vikings D.
Again, we're taking the long view with Mariota, not this week. This week's a tough matchup.
Yeah.
So in terms of maybe a GPP defense or two, what are you looking at here?
I mean, I got Philly here first. 4,800. I do think they're going to be low owned. I mean, I'm looking here. For me, this is the boomer bust play in terms of defense. If you want to kind of pay down just a little bit, obviously the Browns. This is not your last year's Browns. I mean, they do have Corey Coleman, Josh Gordon, but obviously Gordon's not going to play this week. And you still look at RG3. I mean, sure, he's going to be there, but from what we've seen from him, he was a guy we picked on a lot in terms of opposing defenses when he was starting. So I know you and I have talked about this Eagles defense before and kind of being on the fence. I mean, we looked at last year. They were an awful defense. I mean, horrible, but they still do have some playmakers. I do like the upside in terms of special teams. So I do think they're kind of that boomer bust team to take a shot on.
Some underrated talent on that Eagles defense too. And I will say, so I don't have much faith in Robert Griffin. I think this is a great hinge point. The Browns offense versus the Eagles defense, especially on this slate. I think Robert Griffin's an interesting tournament guy, along with Corey Coleman and sort of a lot of guys on this offense. But I mean, there's a good chance Robert Griffin is still just Robert Griffin. You know, there's a chance Hugh Jackson can't totally rejuvenate his career, and we just don't know right now. And I think the Eagles are a great gamble at a pretty reasonable price. So, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, no, I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, I could definitely see the Browns hanging up some points. It's one of those ones where it's like I could really see this one going either way. And I mean, Cleveland's offensive line used to be very solid, not so much of late. I mean, they allowed 3.31 sacks per game last season. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's a reasonable shot, turnover, sacks. I mean, they could rack up some fantasy points.
So I could see, you know, the Browns scoring 17 points, but also having 3 turnovers and the Eagles looking pretty good at the end of the day. So, yeah, I don't know. I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. In terms of the next one here, I mean, I like the Rams value, 4,500. I mean, on the road against the 49ers. And obviously, the 49ers, I don't even know how to describe their offense at this point in the season. I mean, it's just going to be one of those ones where you just kind of target against all the time. And you look at last year, they didn't turn the ball over a ton, but that's just because they were so mediocre as far as just going 3 and out. That it puts the Rams in a good spot. And I'm actually kind of surprised to see the total at or over 20 at this point. But I think for the price, 4,500, I mean, that's a significant drop down from obviously the teams like the Chiefs and teams like, you know, Kansas City.
Yeah, and throughout the offseason, we've kind of been jumping back and forth on who the potential breakout candidate in the Chip Kelly offense is. And I think the reasonable conclusion is no one. I think this team's just going to be, you know, really bad. I think Carlos Hyde's going to have a few good games here and there. I think Torrey Smith's going to have a few games where, and hey, maybe even this week, you know, maybe Torrey Smith gets deep for one deep pass and Blaine Gabbert somehow lobs it up and he somehow gets it over the linebacker in the corner and Blaine Gabbert actually throws over 20 yards. I mean, that could certainly happen. I'm not saying it can't, but, to think it's going to consistently happen against the pressure the Rams are going to be putting on them, I just don't see much potential for this offense this week. I mean, I like Bruce Ellington as a slot guy. He's on IR now. DeAndre Smelter's cut. So it's just like, what do you really expect? Jeremy Curley to come in and, you know, be Mighty Mouse? I don't know.
Right. I mean, I look here, and you expect, I mean, the Rams to run a ton with Gurley. You expect them to have the ball and kind of dominate the time of possession there. And as you mentioned, I mean, you talked a little bit about the Rams, you know, front seven. I mean, very solid pressure last year. I mean, ranked 11th in sacks. You look at that Niners offensive line, it's just another one that you can really target against. Niners averaged just 1.5 touchdowns per game last year. So...
And if you've seen Aaron Donald ever playing ping pong, then you know you're afraid of this front seven. That's all I'm going to say. Is there one more that you're looking at here, or is that it?
Yeah, I'm looking at Arizona as kind of an expensive hopeful. I mean, we saw them last year. I mean, 7 defensive touchdowns. They have that potential. This is certainly the narrative of a quarterback that's inexperienced, going on the road in a very hostile environment. And I mean, this year, I mean, or last year, you look at that front seven, pretty average. It was a lot of their secondary, but they did generate 2.9 sacks at home compared to 1.3 on the road. So they do turn up a little bit in big games at home. which I'm kind of expecting here. Usually we don't see a Patriots offense that sits around a 20-team total. Obviously, there's no Tom Brady. The backfield is still kind of a little bit of a question mark with James White, obviously, possibly leading the way. I'm looking for more of the touchdown upside. I think that could be here, and I actually kind of expect a little bit of a battle, but it might turn into a little bit ugly kind of later on in the game.
This, oh man, this is not what New England needed for their first game, like without Tom Brady. So Cardinals, this is gonna be a tough matchup for them. Obviously, with a healthy Tom Brady, you're really worried about Gronk for this Cardinals defense. You love Tyrann Mathieu, but I don't know, he's got Gronk's got Matthew by like 100 pounds. So that'd be an interesting matchup to sort of watch, and probably still will be, but they're going to be blitzing all day. We kind of know how this Arizona Cardinals defense works. It's going to be getting a lot of pressure on Garoppolo. We'll see if, I'd say it's likely he makes a few mistakes. They're probably going to try to run, and I don't see that being all that successful with Blount. Especially in Arizona, this is just an ugly matchup. So yeah, I mean, even special teams, I like it overall. So yeah, I'm with this quite a bit as well, even though it is expensive.
Yeah, certainly one of those expensive kind of swerves off of guys like Seattle, Kansas City, Houston. I think they're a reasonable shot to kind of go a little bit overlooked here.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. So I guess that's what we're looking at. So overall, I mean, Seahawks, Vikings, and cash. Really the Eagles as a very interesting GPP play, and then I mean, I like the Rams over the Cardinals, but I mean, I think they're both in play as well.
Yeah, Rams is one of those borderline cash too because it is a value as well, 4,500.
So that looks like it for this week, guys. As always, check out Daily Fantasy Cafe for all our awesome tools and content.